What are some substances we use in everyday life? What are these substances made of? What is a substance called when it is made up of only one type of atom? What element is present in the graphite of a pencil? How can elements be categorized? What are some examples of metals? What are some examples of non-metals? What is a physical property of a material? What is the physical state of most metals at room temperature? Which metal is liquid at room temperature? What is the physical state of most non-metals at room temperature? What is the hardness of most metals? Why are metals generally used in making tools and structures? Which metals are soft enough to be cut with a knife? What happens to most non-metals when pressure is applied? Which non-metal forms the hardest known substance? What is the appearance of most metals? Why are metals like platinum, gold, and silver used in jewelry? What is the general appearance of most non-metals? Which non-metal is shiny or lustrous in appearance? What sound do metals make when struck with a hard object? What is the property of producing a ringing sound in metals called? Why are metals used in making bells and wind chimes? What kind of sound do non-metals produce when struck? What are elements called that have both metallic and non-metallic properties? What are some examples of metalloids? What does tensility mean in relation to metals? Why are metals used to build suspension bridges? What is the level of tensility in most non-metals? What does ductility mean in relation to metals? What are some uses of ductile metals? What is the ductility of most non-metals? What does malleability mean in relation to metals? How is malleability useful in making objects? What is the malleability of most non-metals? What is meant by conductivity in metals? Why are metals like aluminium and copper used in utensils and wires? What is the conductivity of most non-metals? What happens when sodium reacts with oxygen present in the air? What is the chemical equation for the formation of sodium oxide? How do iron and copper react with oxygen? What is the reaction called when a substance reacts with oxygen? What is combustion an example of? What do non-metals form when they react with oxygen? What is the nature of non-metal oxides? How can we test whether an oxide is acidic? What is the general chemical equation for the reaction of non-metals with oxygen? What is formed when sulfur is heated in air? What is the chemical equation for the formation of sulfur dioxide? What happens when sulfur dioxide reacts with water? What is the chemical equation for the formation of sulfurous acid? How does sulfurous acid affect litmus paper? Which non-metal is highly reactive even at room temperature? Why is phosphorus stored in water? What is formed when phosphorus reacts with oxygen? What is the equation for the reaction of phosphorus with oxygen? What do metals form when they react with water? What is the general equation for the reaction of metals with water? What happens when sodium reacts with water at room temperature? What is the chemical equation for the reaction of sodium with water? Do all metals react with water in the same way? Which metals react vigorously with water even at room temperature? Which metal reacts with hot water or steam? How do gold and silver react with water? What happens to iron and copper when exposed to moist air for a long time? What is meant by rusting of iron? Over what period does rusting occur? What color does rust turn iron into? What is the chemical composition of rust? What is the chemical equation for rusting of iron? What is corrosion? What causes corrosion of metals? What happens to copper during corrosion? What is the chemical equation for corrosion of copper? What happens to silver when it reacts with hydrogen sulfide? What is the chemical equation for corrosion of silver? Do non-metals react with water? What do metals form when they react with acids? What happens when hydrogen gas is released during a reaction with acids? What is the general equation for a metal reacting with an acid? What is the chemical equation for sodium reacting with hydrochloric acid? What is the chemical equation for magnesium reacting with sulfuric acid? What is the chemical equation for zinc reacting with sulfuric acid? Which metals react vigorously with acids? Which metals react slowly with acids? Do gold and silver react with acids? How do non-metals react with acids? Do metals generally react with bases? What is the general equation for the reaction of metals with bases? What is the reaction of aluminium with sodium hydroxide? What is the reaction of zinc with sodium hydroxide? How do non-metals react with bases? What is a displacement reaction? What determines which metal displaces another in a reaction? What is the activity series of metals? Which metals are found at the top of the activity series? Which metals are found at the bottom of the activity series? Can a more reactive metal displace a less reactive metal? What happens when zinc is placed in copper sulfate solution? What is the equation for the reaction of zinc with copper sulfate? Why does zinc displace copper in copper sulfate solution? What happens when iron is placed in copper sulfate solution? What is the equation for the reaction of iron with copper sulfate? Can a less reactive metal displace a more reactive metal? What happens when an iron nail is placed in zinc sulfate solution? Why does no displacement reaction take place when iron is placed in zinc sulfate solution? In an experiment, copper sulfate solution is poured into 3 beakers. Which metal is placed in each beaker? In which of the 3 beakers will a displacement reaction occur? Which of the following metals can replace zinc from zinc sulfate solution? Platinum, silver, copper or gold? Why are metals considered useful in daily life? What are some uses of shiny metals like silver and gold? What are strong metals like iron used for? Why is copper used for electrical wiring? Why is tungsten used in electric bulb filaments? Why are lightweight metals like aluminium used in vehicles? What are some uses of aluminium besides in vehicles? What is mercury used for? Why are non-metals considered important for living organisms? Why is oxygen essential to human life? What are the medical uses of oxygen? What are the uses of sulfur in industry? What is sulfuric acid used for? In which industry is phosphorus used? What was special about the medals at the Paris Olympics of the year 2024? 2024. What is chlorine used for? What are the uses of nitrogen? What is hydrogen used for in the food and chemical industries? Why is carbon important in plant life? What are hydrocarbons made of? What is coal used for? Why are some metals being replaced by plastics in daily life? What is a suggested topic for a presentation comparing metals and plastics? Why are electric wires made of copper? Why are sitar strings made of metal? Why is aluminium used to make kitchen foils? What is meant by malleability? What is meant by ductility? What is meant by sonority? What is the activity or reactivity series of metals? What is a displacement reaction? What are alloys? Why are alloys created? What is steel an alloy of? What elements are combined to form brass?